I've been to Victoria many times, but never been to this campus and this university. And what a stunning campus it is. And the architecture is incredible. And the history here, the rich history, the naval history is unbelievable. And if you have a chance, if you haven't seen it, well, do walk around a little bit, because I just think it's stunning. What a treat to be here. I'm going to talk about the legacy, Canada's Great War legacy, 100 years on. We've just passed through the centennial. 4 years of thinking about, reflecting upon, commemorating the Great War, this terrible conflict 100 years ago, a cataclysm in world history, a cataclysm whose reverberations I think we still feel to this day. I'm a Canadian historian. I believe it's important to tell our stories, and so I'll focus on Canada. And as part of this, I'll talk a little bit about my new book as well, and when I get there, we will do that. And let's see, moment of truth, if this works. Oh, look at that. There were 630,000 Canadians who served in the First World War. That's from a country of 8 million, 1 in 3 adult males. Today's equivalent, we're about 5 times as large, about 3.5 million Canadians serving. These were citizen soldiers. They were fathers, they were uncles, they were brothers. They came from every region in Canada, every class, almost every religion. They came to fight for king and country. They fought for their families. They fought for what they believed in. And I'm going to just start with one of them, Private George Price. You can see him here on the left. He was 25 years old. He was conscripted in 1918. He was born in Nova Scotia, but he was a farmhand in Saskatchewan at the time. He went overseas in early 1918. He was gassed during those early battles. He fought during the 100 Days campaign, that series of battles that are considered, I think, by many historians to be the most important fought by the Canadians. He wasn't special in any way, except that he was the last Canadian killed on the Western Front, shot through the chest at 10:58 a.m. on November 11th, 1918. And I think Private Price represents the sadness and the futility of the war. There were other Canadians who died after November 11th. Of course, the Spanish flu that swept through Canada, the pandemic that swept around the world that we think killed 50,000 in Canada, some 50 million worldwide. At least 1,000 Canadian soldiers died from that. Imagine that, having survived the fighting on the Western Front, to be felled by the flu, or in other cases, to come back after 2 or 3 years of being away to your family to find your mother and your 2 siblings dead. As I remember reading the letters of one soldier, a Private Arthur Lapointe, who came back to find that almost all of his siblings, more than half a dozen, had been killed by the flu. Other Canadians died, but Private Price, I think, represents that terrible loss in this tragic war that killed 9 million worldwide on the battlefield, several million civilians who died from direct attack, from starvation, from genocide. A war that destroyed 4 empires, a war that created multiple countries, a war that saw the United States rise to become a superpower, that saw communism unleashed in the world, this war that remade the Middle East. And we often think about the individuals, and we often think about people like Price. Today's talk, though, goes beyond that, the futility and the loss, to look at some of the legacies of the war. I think if we are reflecting upon the First World War, now more than 100 years later, I'd like to offer you some thoughts on why it has continued to matter to us as Canadians. And I can't go into a lot of detail about the First World War itself, except to say that it was the most difficult, the most withering, costly thing we had done in our history up to that point. 50 years since Confederation, those 630,000 Canadians in uniform. It was a monumental contribution, one that no Canadian imagined in August of 1914 would have to be called upon of them and of their countrymen and countrywomen, and yet one that unspooled over 4 long years, that would nearly tear the country apart while bringing us together like never before. We often think of the fighting forces overseas, but we were an agricultural nation at the time. More than half of Canadians lived in rural communities. We were a food superpower. I think this is fascinating because we don't often talk about Canada in terms of the home front and our contributions overseas, but the First World War took about 200 million young men out of society and into their armies around the world. By 1916, much of the belligerent nations were starving, not the Western nations. And Canadian wheat fed the French and the Belgian armies and the British armies and our Canadian soldiers overseas. We sent over hundreds of millions of bushels of wheat. That was a monumental contribution from Canada. We also made shells. We had no shell industry before the war. There was no reason to have a shell industry. We had one factory that produced the Ross rifle, a Canadian-made rifle that wasn't particularly good, or at least wasn't particularly good on the battlefield. In fact, it was not a bad sniping rifle, but once you used it in a rapid-fire situation in the trenches, it jammed, as it did on the battlefield, led to the deaths of countless Canadians. But our shell industry was monumental. By 1917, we had 600 factories, 250,000 men and women working in those factories. The British Expeditionary Force, by late 1917, a third to a quarter of all the shells fired were made in Canada. An incredible contribution. And yet it is the Canadian Corps, I think, that we think of when we think of Canada's First World War. The Canadian Corps, our primary fighting force, 4 divisions strong, 100,000 soldiers by late 1916. Think about that, 100,000 soldiers in the Canadian Corps. D&D and the whole Canadian Force is only something like 65,000 people today. And I don't know how many at the sharp end, but it's probably about 15% of that number. 100,000 soldiers fighting. The trial by fire battle from the 1st Canadian Division at the Battle of Second Ypres, where the Germans unleashed the chlorine gas attack, where the Canadians fought and stood their ground and counterattacked at places like Kitchener's Wood, where the 16th Battalion, raised here in Victoria, fought so aggressively, successfully, but suffered such horrendous casualties, withstanding that gas attack. That's where John McCrae rode in Flanders Fields, fighting at Festubert in May of 1915, a forlorn slaughter. Trench warfare over late 15, early 16, the Battle of Saint-Eloi in April of 1916, the Battle of Montserrat in June of 1916, largely forgotten today, 9,000 Canadian casualties there. The Canadian contributions on the Somme with the Newfoundland Regiment fighting on the 1st of July, and then the Canadians fighting from September of 1916, fighting at Courcelette for the first time in the history of warfare with tanks. There, the Canadians made small gains for 24,000 casualties, but they were learning on the Western Front. They were learning to fight more effectively, learning how to fight together, how to incorporate artillery into the attack doctrine, to upgun the soldiers with Lewis machine guns, to introduce new infantry tactics, to decentralize command. And they took those lessons to Vimy, where the 4 Canadian divisions attacked together for the first time and captured that nearly impregnable ridge from the 9th of April to the 12th of April 1917, a victory where everyone else in the past had failed. The French and the Germans who had fought over that ridge for 2 years, more than 400,000 casualties they suffered. And it was the Canadians who captured that ridge, and they continued to fight with Sir Arthur Currie from Victoria in command of the Canadian Corps from June of 1917, Canada's most effective battlefield general in our history, I would argue, who led the Canadians at Hill 70 in August of 1917, at Passchendaele, in that bog of unburied mud and corpses. Somehow the Canadians fought their way up that ridge in 4 set-piece battles from the 26th to the 30th of October, capturing Passchendaele village, what was left of it on the 6th of November, and finally what was left of the ridge on the 10th. These were the Canadian contributions up to 1917. Absolutely incredible for a nation that had almost no professional army before the war. And I have spent 25 years studying and writing about this war, as Jeff has said, in 11 books. I am continually astonished by these stories of courage, of tenacity, of loss, of grief. And there are other stories that I continually learn. I'm the curator, the historian at the Canadian War Museum. I just finished an exhibition on Sir Alfred Munnings, Now, that's probably not a name that will resonate with you. He was a great horse painter, British horse painter. But during the course of the war, he painted Canadian soldiers on the battlefield. In fact, there was this incredible art program created by Lord Beaverbrook, that mischievous millionaire gnome who romps through British history and a friend to Churchill and David Lloyd George and others. He used his considerable funds. He was a Canadian expat living in London. He used his funds to create an official art program, official film program, and official photography. He left this powerful legacy, and I wonder where would we be today without that legacy? I'd be showing you paintings and photographs of British soldiers saying, imagine the Canadians here. Because the Canadian government didn't have the foresight to do this. It was Lord Beaverbrook. That's a long way to come around to Sir Alfred Munnings, whose paintings I think are quite lovely. We have 41 of them at the War Museum. They tend to sell for $1 to $2 million each. It's pretty astonishing to look at this and to handle it. He painted the Canadian Cavalry Brigade, and he painted the Canadian Forestry Corps, another unit that we generally forget about. 22,000 Canadians, these soldier lumberjacks who go overseas largely from British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, whose job it was to cut the wood. And of course, it's a war of millions of soldiers. You need roads, you need all that wood in the trenches, you need incredible amounts. And by 1918, 70% of all the wood used by the British Expeditionary Force is being cut by Canadian lumberjacks. Another unsung story, another important legacy from the war. And in that final year, the final year of battle, the Canadian Corps, 100,000 strong, commanded by Sir Arthur Currie, thrown into some of the most difficult battles of the war. The Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August, 1918, the great tank attack where the Canadians and the Australians spearhead the Allied counterattack. Everyone expects this war to go to 1919, even 1920. Amiens shows that the German army is rotten. The Canadians are thrown into another battle at Arras, east of Amiens. The German defenses there, their trench system, it's not trenches anymore, trench system, 10 kilometers deep, thousands of machine guns in concrete pillboxes. The Canadians are thrown into battle there on the 27th of August. 26th of August, and they fight their way forward for a week, finally breaking the German positions. Then they're thrown into a third major battle to cross the Canal du Nord, to capture Cambrai, the essential German-controlled logistical town where all the railways go through. The Germans have do-or-die orders to hold this position. The Canadians fight their way forward and drive the Germans out. And finally, the final 5 weeks of the war, where the Canadians will finally liberate Mons on the last day of war. During that time, the Canadian Corps of 4 divisions with the occasional British division attached to it met and defeated elements of 47 German divisions. And we paid a terrible price, 45,000 casualties during that time. It's a time when historians say the Canadian Corps contributed most to victory on the Western Front. But in terms of legacy, there's another story there. It's that image on the right. It's the liberation. We don't often think of the First World War as a war of liberation, do we? It's the war of the trenches. It's a war of attrition. It's a war of terrible slaughter. And yet, Britain went to war because Belgium was attacked and ultimately occupied. There are other reasons, of course, but that's one of the main rationales. And Canada was automatically at war. And these Canadian soldiers, whose letters and diaries I have read over the last 25 years, talk about this, the terrible casualties and the terrible losses. But at the same time, they understand why they are there, because they are liberating the French and then the Belgians. We liberate 225 villages, towns, and cities in the last 100 days. And the Canadians are greeted as liberators. That's another way to think about the First World War. We have many ways that we construct memory over time. We remember, we forget. We elevate, we push aside. And the memory that has emerged over the last 100 years is sometimes quite different, I think, than what those Canadians would have thought about their war. And that's really going to be the focus of my talk, along with the legacies that come out of the First World War. And certainly one of those legacies, it's a little warm in here, I'm going to take my jacket off here. One of those legacies of the conflict are those losses, those terrible casualties. 66,000 Canadians killed during the war. 66,000. Imagine the grief, imagine the sorrow. Again, to think of us as a country 5 times as large, today's equivalent would be 330,000 dead. It's not a fair comparison, but think of the Afghanistan conflict with the 160 or so Canadians killed, and of course the terrible legacy of suicide that is still with us from that conflict. How did this generation deal with those losses? It plagued them. It is a dark legacy. Mothers and fathers traded their sons in for the dead man penny there, letters of condolence. Think of that grief. Think of the thousands of orphans and widows. This is a powerful legacy from the war, and one that haunts us still. Those Canadians, for the most part, were buried overseas in what was then known as the Imperial War Graves Commission, now today the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Those silent cemeteries are powerful sites of remembrance, of sorrow. I imagine some of you have been there. You have walked them. I went there for the first time when I was 17 years old. I looked at Canadians buried there who were younger than I was at this time. They are places of great sorrow and for some great pride. I think of the epitaphs below the headstones. Known unto God, a soldier who was not only lost to his family and to his country, but whose name was erased, so badly mangled or destroyed by shell fire that we do not know who that is other than he is a Canadian. There are another 18,000 Canadians whose bodies were destroyed or lost, whose names are captured on Vimy Ridge, where there are 11,285 names, and on the Menin Gate, where there are almost 7,000 Canadians who joined 55,000 other Allied soldiers. To go there is to feel the weight of history, to feel the terrible loss. But also, I think, and I have written about Vimy in a book 2 years ago, it's a place where Canadians are reclaimed, where the lost have been brought back to their country, where we can commemorate and think about them and reflect upon their service and sacrifice. These are powerful legacies from the war overseas. There are also legacies at home. With the bodies buried overseas, there was a need in Canadian communities to mark this sacrifice. And the communities came together. They raised their own funds and they built stone memorials. They built and erected plaques, and schools had lists of the fallen. There were stained glass windows. There are many forms of memorials in this country. There are naming aspects. We name geographical features, lakes and mountains after the fallen. There are personal aspects of naming. Those soldiers who left behind a best friend, who named their children after a fallen comrade. In the 1921 census, I looked it up, there are more than a dozen children named Vimy. It seeps through our history in many ways, but these losses matter to this day. And the local memorials are perhaps the most powerful places to come together, to mark the fallen. There are 4,000 of these across the country. Wherever you are from, I suspect there is a monument and a memorial to the First World War. And they often contain the names of the fallen. They are the embodiment of those soldiers that we buried and left overseas in the care of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. They are places where we continue to return to, powerful stone memorials, where we visit to pay our solemn respects on Armistice Day, as it was known, from 1919, and on Remembrance Day from 1931. Think of the other symbols from the war, the poppy, 2 minutes of silence, John McCrae's poem. These are aspects of the legacy of the war itself. The dead we knew what to do with, in a very broad and perhaps callous phrase. The living were more difficult to treat, to mark, to care for. I talked about the 66,000 dead. There were 172,000 wounded Canadians out of this war. 138,000 of them wounded on the battlefield. Many suffering traumatic amputations. What was the debt that was owed to our veterans? How you end wars is important. Also, how you treat veterans at the end of wars are important. It shapes how we remember wars. In Canada, we felt there was an obligation to care for our veterans. There were pensions for the wounded, more generous pensions than what the German soldiers received and what British soldiers received, but still not enough for men who had arms or legs cut away or were blinded, who suffered through gassed lungs, who could never return to the workplace, or who always suffered through pain their whole lives. We struggled with this, and the government struggled to treat these veterans all through the 1920s, and in fact, some of them to this very day. And one of the things the government was forced to do was to embrace a new state medical system. The First World War conditioned the state, both at the provincial level and the federal level, to care for these veterans. We built more than 40 hospitals across the country to take care of veterans. We had limb factories. There were 2 glass eye production sites. The CNIB was in fact formed in 1918 for blinded soldiers, those blinded by steel and shrapnel, those blinded by mustard gas that burned out their corneas. The facially disfigured, those men whose faces were so terribly destroyed, had to be cared for. New professions were created, like massage therapists, facial reconstruction. All of this came from the state, and this is a powerful legacy from the First World War. One we don't normally think about, but the need to care for our veterans forced us to think about how we would eventually care for all Canadians in terms of health. And then, of course, there were the veterans themselves. We'd had veterans before. There were about 8,000 veterans from the South African War, about that number for the Northwest Rebellion or Northwest Resistance, no matter how you think of that. But this is a war that created about 550,000 veterans in Canada. They were a force. They came back. They built up our country. Most returned to their farms and their families and their communities, but some went on to be leaders in business and university. 2 became prime minister. They contributed to our country. And yet still we struggled with how to care for them, how to repay that debt, how to deal with the soldiers suffering from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, which was not well understood at the time. There were about 9,000 recorded cases of shell shock during the war, but those typically were physical wounds, shells exploding and causing brain lesions, but also psychological wounds. And of course, after the war, what we now call PTSD, veterans were coming down with that, but it was a very different time. Issues of masculinity, very different. How people talked about the war, very different. What we could do for those suffering from psychological wounds was minimal at the best of times. Even then, by the early 1930s, at least 30,000 veterans were receiving pensions for psychological wounds, which they called burnout cases at the time. And that too was a legacy that generation and others had to deal with. The government was asked to care for these men and some women, the 3,000 nurses who served, but it was in debt. It's fairly easy to go to war. It's not easy to pay for war. Canada had a debt of about $2 billion. This is before the age of Keynesian economics. That was seen as a crippling debt, and successive governments felt they could not be terribly generous to the veterans. One thing they could give to them, in addition to some training, like we see with some of these posters here, was land. We've always given our veterans land, at least in the 19th century and the 18th century. But by 1919, 1920, most of the good land had disappeared. And so despite the fact that tens of thousands of veterans had the opportunity and took it, the land they received was rocky and poor. And by 1930, 10 years or so after the war, half of them had gone bankrupt, and we think maybe perhaps as high as 80%. It was a very hard life for them, and they suffered. And many of the veterans felt disillusioned by their war experience, not during the war, which is an interesting and important caveat to make. Most of them understood they were fighting for a just reason, an important cause. It was infused by propaganda, it was infused by the politicians, by the church, but they understood why they were fighting, to liberate Europe. After the war, though, the poor treatment of veterans often led to the sense of disillusionment that would go on for many, many years, although not all veterans. Another legacy of the war was the empowerment of the state. The government became more intrusive in the lives of Canadians. The War Measures Act allowed the government to basically do anything during the course of the war. Censorship of newspapers, to lock up Canadians without access to habeas corpus. It was intrusive. To pay for the war, it brought in income tax. 1916, 1917. It's supposed to be temporary. We might remind someone of that at some point. War bonds to help pay for the war. $2 billion, or something close to that, Canadians contributed to this war effort. These were legacies from the government, but perhaps the most important legacy, and one not acknowledged in many histories at all, is that our traditional we borrowed from London. But by the midpoint of the war, London was bankrupt. And so we were forced to turn to the Americans. And we went to Washington and New York, and Sir Robert Borden, our Prime Minister, went there, cap in hand, to borrow hundreds of millions, which the Americans gave to us or lent to us at very high interest rates. And that enraged Canadians. But the long-term legacy there is that we moved away from the London markets to more North American markets. And that's a powerful legacy that we don't often talk about, a totally unintended one, as many of these legacies are. No one went to war in 1914 for banking issues. No one went to war in 14 thinking about what we owed veterans. No one went to war thinking income tax would be a good thing to do. And yet all of these and many more came out of the war itself. The Americans were not well loved by Canadians during the First World War. They hadn't gone to war on the side of democracy or justice, as many people called it at the time, or liberal ideas. Of course, the Americans stayed neutral until April of 1917. But we should remember that some 40,000 Americans served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. That's a fairly astonishing number of Americans. They served with Canadians, they fought with Canadians, they died with Canadians. And this is a cross of sacrifice in Arlington Cemetery, which marks those Americans who died serving with the Canadian Expeditionary Force. One of those legacies that we do not remember today, but an important one, I think, when we talk to our American friends. Women played a key role during the First World War, a key role in the patriotic movement on the home front. We often focus on and think about the nurses who served overseas, about 3,000 who served during the course of the war. And they made important contributions, but I often ask, what happened to the 3 million women on the home front? Many of them were supportive of the war effort. They raised millions of dollars, some $50 million for the Patriotic Fund, for the soldiers' dependents, for their children, for their wives. They contributed in massive giving campaigns. And one of the interesting legacies of the war that we don't often talk about, one that is still with us today, is the giving campaigns. Canadians gave tens of millions of dollars to the war effort. They felt it was their duty. The phrase of the day was, "do your bit." That's something that's still with us today. Whenever you get a letter from the hospital or the university or the sports club or whatever to give, I think we could trace that back to the First World War, an unintended consequence. Women as well. And another unintended consequence, moving from the domestic sphere to the paid workforce, working in banks, on lorry cars, ambulances, the places where the jobs the men had left behind, and of course in the factories. And this is one of our fabulous paintings at the Canadian War Museum. You see women working in the dirty, loud, dangerous shell factories. And you can see in the foreground there some of the 18-pounder shells that they're working on. Often these women and the men who work there as well were poisoned by the chemicals. that they handled every day. And sometimes they were known, the women, as canaries because their skin and hair would turn yellow from the various chemicals that poisoned them. And of course, they received no compensation for that. That was simply what they did. We have struggled as historians to think about women in the First World War and to evaluate them, and we know what they have done. All of those who entered the workforce, they almost all lost their jobs in 1919. So there are some scholars who say there was nothing gained by these women, and that may be a fair argument to say. There's a fabulous film by the NFB from 1994 called And We Learned How to Dance, and I encourage you to look for it. It's on YouTube now. And at the time, they interviewed about 12 women. I think their ages were 86 to 102. And these women talk about their war experiences, and they're fabulous. And they talk about being in the factories, and they talk about their contributions. Their brothers had gone off to war. Their fathers had gone off to war. And here was their chance to serve and to contribute. And they all spoke with tremendous pride. And I wonder how many of those women passed on that pride to their daughters who would serve in the Second World War. 50,000 in uniform. Millions more contributing in a paid workforce. Perhaps there are some legacies that are not easily quantifiable. Certainly one that is enfranchisement for women. Women received the right to vote. Those connected to a soldier, I love that image on the right there. One who had sent a husband or a brother or a father off, they received the right to vote in the 1917 election. It was a deliberate bribe from the Unionist government. That was Borden's Win the War, liberals and conservatives that came together. But it's a legacy of the war. It would have happened at some point, but we can attribute that to the war experience. There were other legacies from the war, dark legacies from the war. We came together like never before. Our patriotic funds, the demand to support the boys overseas, and yet at the same time, this crusading spirit was a dark legacy. And Canadians turned on one another. We looked for the others in our midst. We looked for those who were different from us. We looked for the spies, and there were all kinds of spy crazes during the course of the war. Looking for German Canadians. It's not a good time to be a German Canadian, and I think you've had your Lusitania riots, Jeff was telling me about, after the sinking of Lusitania in May of 1915. German businesses were boycotted, and windows were broken, and their businesses were burned down. They were driven from teaching jobs. They were driven from jobs. Some 9,000 enemy aliens, they were called, were locked up during the course of the war. This was a massive infringement on civil rights, what we would now call civil rights, not a phrase from the time. War brings out the best and it brings out the worst. And about 6,000 of those 9,000 Canadians were Ukrainian Canadians. And it's always seemed a bit odd to me why they were singled out. But the Ukraine at the time was a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and we were at war with them, even though we didn't fight against the Austrians on the Western Front. And so those Ukrainians were singled out. And it was a very hurtful experience and a very dark legacy in their history. And they fought for a formal apology, which they received in 2005. I've always found it interesting that German Canadians never asked for an official apology of any sort, and they seem to have accepted that these things happen. But that's the nature of redress campaigns that emerged really in Canada from the late 1980s onwards with the Japanese-Canadian redress campaign, which opened up a whole series of grievances for various groups that had felt wronged and were wronged in the past and seeking some recompense. It comes, again, prominently from the First World War, although there were Chinese head taxes and things like that beforehand. Canada was roiling with anger, roiling with unrest. The veterans who came back joined labor movements, and they were on the opposite side. And I always think the Winnipeg General Strike is a fascinating story for all kinds of reasons. I'll just focus on one. Veterans were on both sides. They were with the Northwest Mounted Police, and they were with the strikers. Here were men who fought shoulder to shoulder only 6 months earlier against the Germans, and here they were fighting each other in the streets, and as we know, killing each other in the streets. This was Canada in 1919, broken, suffering from the strain of the war and the uncertainty of how this country would go forward. There was much anger and unrest. One of the legacies of the war is the creation of new political parties. Farmers in the West had felt abandoned by the two traditional parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, and then from 1917, the Unionist Party. Farmers in particular, their sons had been promised that they would not be conscripted, that the agricultural war was just as important as the shooting war, and the Unionist government broke that promise in April of 1918 and conscripted those young boys. And it created tremendous anger and unrest. And we saw the rise of farmers' parties in many of the provinces and the rise of the Progressive Party from the West, which in the 1921 election became the official opposition. They weren't terribly effective because they refused to act like a real party, but they would lead to the CCF in the early 1930s and the NDP in 1961. You could attribute that to the First World War and the anger that came out of it in a political sense. Surely an important legacy to think about. There are other legacies of veterans, the 222 Japanese Canadians who went overseas. I think 54 of them were killed. They came back to British Columbia where they did not have the right to vote. They fought for that right and they received it, I think in 1929 or maybe it's 1931. Just the veterans though. Indigenous veterans did the same thing. About 4,000 Indigenous veterans served. When they came back, the survivors, they fought for greater rights in Canada. They had gone overseas, and almost universally, they talked about being accepted as equals by their white comrades in arms, standing shoulder to shoulder, protecting one another, living together, fighting together, dying together. They got to vote in the 1917 election, the soldiers' Carkey election. When they came back, they'd have to wait another 43 years before they could vote in 1960. In the 20s, Indigenous veterans banded together. They fought for greater rights. They generally did not succeed. The state was powerful, the Indian agents working against them on the reserves, and yet this is one of the legacies that would continue through the Second World War and Indigenous rights battles in the 1960s, where many Second World War veterans were involved in that, and to this very day. Legacies of the war, different legacies for different communities within our country. There are national legacies. There are more limited identity legacies. One of the darkest legacies, of course, was in Quebec, French Canada, which saw the war very differently than English Canada. French Canada contributed tens of thousands of soldiers to the war, but not in the same proportional numbers as English Canada. It was an English army. Sir Sam Hughes, the Minister of Militia, was a bigot against the French for the first 2 years of the war. There wasn't the same pull of empire as there was for English Canada, for Britain. I always found that surprising that French Canadians didn't feel the same pull and draw to liberate the French. And yet many in French Canada felt that France had abandoned them after 1763. And yet French Canadians did serve, but they were condemned by English Canadians as the war required more and more men. And conscription was brought in, as we know, in May of 1917 and fought throughout the summer and eventually in the December 1917 election. And I love the two posters here, I think, capturing that send more men, the desperate soldier there, who looks like he's from Kitchener-Wood. And then the cartoon on the right, it says there, this mud is supplied by Canada's anti-conscriptionists, this idea that the anti-conscriptionists are holding the soldiers back. That election in 1917 was, I think, the most divisive in our history. To see the language and the rhetoric is shocking. Quebec accused of being a traitorous nation, a cancer, a blight on the country. And what Quebec was saying about English Canada was not much better. In March and early April 1918, there was rioting in Quebec City over the conscription issue. And on the 1st of April, after several days of rioting, there were shootings in the streets. The militia shot into a large crowd of protesting French Canadians after having first read the Riot Act and having first had several soldiers shot by French Canadians in those crowds. And yet they opened up with Lewis machine guns and Ross rifles, and by the end of the day, 5 civilians were killed and close to 100 others were wounded. Canadians were killing each other in the street. This is Kent State. This is bitter, bitter. And the legacy in French Canada was very different, of course, than that in English Canada. In French Canada, the war was seen largely as a divisive event. In English Canada, it's seen as the event that propels us forward to full nationhood. And this is a wonderful cartoon, I think. You see John Bull there, the British general, looking at a sign, Canada is the empire's greatest what? Colony crossed out, Dominion crossed out, nation. This idea that through the war, through our service and sacrifice at the front and at home, Canada has emerged as a new nation. It's not wrong. Borden went to Versailles. Canada did have a voice to end the war. We did join the League of Nations. It didn't happen on November 11th, 1918 that we became this nation. It's been an evolving process over decades, and I think we can all look back and think about times when Canada has changed. But this war played a key role in ushering in that change, which many historians look at the Statute of Westminster in 1931 as seeing it as a key change event for Canada when we took control of our foreign policy. The next time we would go to war, we would decide when to go. The war also created new heroes. We'd always had heroes in this country, every country does, but most of our heroes were British military heroes, maybe Canadian politicians, depending on your stripe. But the war created new heroes. Many of you, I hope, would recognize Billy Bishop here, seen as a great Canadian, Victoria Cross recipient. There were other heroes out of the war, the nurses, the other 60-odd Victoria Cross recipients, Sir Arthur Currie, the Corps commander, John McCrae, various doctors and surgeons. We created new heroes, and that was part of the creation of a Canadian identity. We fought under the maple leaf. From June of 1917, Sir Arthur Currie was our Corps commander. He's an important national symbol. Our units were called the Canadian Battalion or Battery. We were not just British soldiers. It was an active publicity campaign as well from Lord Beaverbrook, who I mentioned before, who talked about the Canadians being all frontiersmen. And there are cartoons and jokes about this, that every Canadian was born in an igloo with a rifle in their hand, and we spent our time hunting polar bears. And of course, the Canadians love to play this up as well. Right? It helps to distinguish us from the British, even though, wink, wink, half of the Canadian Expeditionary Force was born in Britain. There's a great line from a journalist who said, as part of this article, doesn't matter where you came from. We all fought under the maple leaf, and we all fought together. You may have been something before, but now you are Canadian. And that captures, I think, an important sentiment that emerges out of this war. Canadian heroes, Canadian culture created. The most famous English poem of the war, John McCrae's poem. McCrae, who died of pneumonia in early 1918, his poem has lived on to this day. It's a fascinating poem. If you look at it, published in December of 1915, although you can't probably see that cursive, although I imagine everyone here can recite it, right? If I start the first lines, you'll continue. But it's a martial poem. To you from failing hands we throw, the torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, right? It's about keeping up the fight against the Germans. And yet the genius of McCrae's poem, I think, is that after the war it becomes a poem of remembrance. That torch is about keeping up the need to remember. And I think that's where it draws its power from. That's the power of McCrae's in Flanders Fields after the war. We created new artists. John McCrae did not live to see this, but there were others who wrote about the war. They wrote novels, they had plays. The Dumbbells that toured across Canada in the 1920s. Artists, 4 of the 7 members of the group of 7, painted in an official capacity. A.Y. Jackson here. He said that we had created soldiers and armies, and now we must create artists and poets and others who create things. The war had stimulated a Canadian way of thinking and acting. And this takes us to my new book, A Roundabout Way to Get Here. It's a book that I've spent the better part of 20 years thinking about and researching. It goes all the way back to my time at RMC when I was a civilian there on a scholarship. I wrote my first book on gas warfare. I was reading hundreds and then thousands of letters and diaries looking for that 3-letter word gas. And I eventually came across rum over and over again. I realized that rum was important to the soldiers. And not just because they liked to drink rum, which they did. It was strong rum, at least 151 proof. Came from Jamaica. They talked about drinking it and the young guys having to go down and come right back up again. And they saw it as a form of medicine, these soldiers. Having survived the day in the trench, they got it in the morning, standing in the muck, and they got it at nighttime, standing in the muck if they survived the day. And it kept them going, and the officers used it to control and exert power. Who's going on a trench raid tonight? No hands. 2 shots of rum, all hands. Right? It kept soldiers who were in the bad books. It was a form of punishment. You didn't get your rum if you were on some form of minor punishment. So rum was important. I also found, though, that rum was coming up in the songs and the poetry and the cartoons. And I thought, isn't that interesting? This is a culture of sorts. I was a young guy at the time. I took note of it, and I continued to think about this over my last 10 books or so. And this book came out about 6 months ago, and it's about the culture of the soldiers, but it's culture as a shield. It's about culture binding these young guys together. And my question was, how did they cope and endure? How did they survive? We know about tactics and generalship and the changing strategy and operational effectiveness and this and that. But I wanted to know how the individual soldiers survived. And I have been very lucky to read their letters and diaries for years, and that's where the secret history is. It's not in the official records. It's about creating a society of soldiers, and those of you who have served in the Canadian Forces know that it is a unique society. It has its own slang and swearing, which is what I talk about here. It has its own rhythm. It's difficult to understand. It's not meant to be understood. When they write jokes and put on theater shows and sing songs, it's not meant for us 100 years later. It was meant for them. And so you have to interpret it. You have to understand the context. And yet, I argue, it is important to understand. This is a shield that protects them from the unending strain. My book talks about superstitions, ghost stories, spectral beings that are seen on the battlefield. It looks at cross-dressing behind the lines and sports. It looks at a whole bunch of things, and you should run off and buy that book as soon as you can. But it also looks at the veterans' culture after the war, when these veterans come back. And I wanted to know what happened to the culture. Did it come back with them? And often it did. Those ghost stories and spectral beings, they are left behind. But the songs come back. And the trench newspapers become regimental histories and regimental newspapers. And one of the great themes, I think, and sad themes in the veterans' experience are the silences. When I talk to Canadians across this country, I often hear, I wish I'd had a chance to talk to my dad or my grandfather about his war experience. We often didn't know the questions we wanted to ask. They often did not have the answers that we were looking for. There was a silence there. And a lot of these veterans internalized their war experience, but others talked about it, but in the Legion halls. That's why those Legion halls were so important. And the unit associations and the armories. It's a place where the veterans could gather to talk, to work through their war experience. The songs and the jokes and the nostalgia are crucial, I argue, as part of a cathartic process of working through the war, and my book tries to address that. And I think it's important for understanding another one of these hidden legacies of, in this case, the Great War. There were other legacies from the war that I can't get into, and I'm going to wind it down in the next 5 minutes or so and open up the floor. We'll have some questions, I hope. There was a peace movement that emerged from the First World War. A very strong peace movement in the 20s. It faded away by the 30s as we saw the rise of the fascists and people began to realize there was very little opportunity to negotiate with someone like Hitler by the late 1930s. There was the legacy of the Canadian Corps, and Currie's ghost, I think, plagued Crear, our army commander in the Second World War. The Second World War Army was always being compared unfavorably to Currie's Corps in the First World War. I've written 4 books on the Second World War. I'll tell you here, the Canadian Army in the Second World War had significant victories and played a key role as well. But often British and American historians either forget completely about us or downplay our contributions, and sometimes by comparing it to Currie and the Canadian Corps in the First World War. There's other legacies. Newfoundland, which was a separate dominion, which suffered more than 1,600 dead during the course of the war, which was bankrupted by the war, and which ultimately would join Canada, as we know, in 1949. And many of those people, bitter Newfoundlanders who lost their country, blamed the First World War for that. A legacy that is now our legacy as well, as all Canadians. The war continued to matter, and by the 1960s, even as Great War veterans were dying in larger numbers, with more veterans being buried here in Canada than on the Western Front, the war came back around again. New cultural products, new histories, new novels, new plays. In Britain, they were often very negative towards the British generals, especially Sir Douglas Haig, the commander-in-chief, who was depicted as a bungling butcherer. In Canada, it was a little different. We wrote books about Vimy. This is the period where Vimy takes on tremendous purpose for Canada as a national symbol. It is, in fact, in 1967 when Lester B. Pearson says, Vimy was the birth of the nation. It was a period, you will remember, when Canada was looking forward 100 years with great pride, but also looking back for symbols that had bound us together. And what Pearson meant by that, I argue, in my book on Vimy, was not that Vimy was the birth of the nation, but that the First World War changed us as a people. It was shorthand, and Vimy is shorthand for that. Not the four-day battle. Not the four-day battle for victory, which was significant in its own right, but because we built our national monument there, and the monument stands for all of Canada's dead. And so you see a combining of the battle and the monument and the idea, as I call it, the legend of Vimy over time. And the First World War continued to resonate throughout the 60s and 70s and 80s as our veterans passed away. I talked about Price as the last Canadian killed before the armistice. We lost our last veteran, John Babcock, 109 years old in 2010. He was the last of his generation. And shortly thereafter, the world lost all of its veterans. And there was a severing to this past, a severing to these eyewitnesses to history. And I was, at the time, asked, Cook, what's it going to be? Is the First World War going to fade away? Is it going to become like the War of 1812, force-fed to us through our various schools and not resonating in various places? And I said, well, I'm not sure. I'm a historian. I'm more comfortable looking backwards than forwards. But I think it will continue to resonate. It's too important. We as Canadians have said it is important. It resonates in many ways. And I think of the descendants. 550,000 veterans who survived. There are millions of Canadians who have a direct link to a grandfather, a great-grandmother who served in the war. I have met them across the country. I was just at the Western Front Association. A very strong feeling that the national history is infused by the personal history. And I think we as a people will continue to keep the Great War relevant and important. And this takes me to our most recent period, the last 4 years, where we marked the war not the same way that the Australians did, or the French, or the British, but our key event was, not surprisingly, at Vimy, this mythical place, this place where Canadians came to pay their respects. You will remember 25,000 Canadians went to Vimy for the 9th of April 2017. That's astonishing. 25,000 Canadians from across the country. 12,000 of them were high school students. They paid their own way. They were drawn there. They felt compelled to go. Many were bearing witness, I think, to service and sacrifice. A time of tremendous loss and grief, a place of pride. If you have been to Vimy, it is quite unlike any other place I've ever visited. A place where tears come very freely and easily. They are tears of pride. They are tears for our memories of a generation that has passed. They are tears for our country. It is an important place, and it's one, I think, that haunts us. And I'm going to finish here on Will Longstaff's famous painting, The Ghosts of Vimy. Longstaff was an Australian. He painted this in 1929. I think it's fascinating. The monument was not unveiled until 1936, so he's imagining the monument as it will be. And yet you can see the battlescape here is pitted with shells and craters. This is the battlescape from 1917. The past and the future. And of course, the ghostly spectral Canadian soldiers who forever are there. The blood we spilt, the lives we expended, this is our ridge. This is our story. This is our history. And I think as we move into the second 100 years of the Great War, it will continue to matter to us because we have said that it matters. Thank you very much, everyone.